Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I see people have been telling us where they're coming in from. If you want to comment and say hi, if you can see me, that'd be great. Let us know where you're from if you're just joining in now. And we're going to dive right in. So welcome, everyone, to the Lucid News PsychSem's inaugural integration conversation. This is the first of our roundtable discussions, and we're basing them on stories that have been published on Lucid News with a focus on current events. Today's discussion will be, what does the drug war look like under Biden? And where our guests, we're going to examine the history of Joe Biden's punitive drug policies and recent promises of reform during the Biden-Harris presidential campaign. So links to legislation discussed are in the story, and I'm going to put the links to the stories in the comment bar right now so that you guys are able to follow along. I'm just going to type that in now. I will add that in later. Those are actually two links. So just feel free to open those up in some other windows. A little reminder, this discussion is going to unfold in two parts on two platforms. So the first here is in Crowdcast, and the second is in Zoom, where we will, to the best of our ability, replicate what would happen in a real event. Meaning we are creating a space for people to meet each other and mingle and discuss. It's going to be somewhat structured so that folks get to connect with each other and discuss any points that we didn't get to in tonight's Q&A. So I'm going to put the link in the browser for that as well. It's not going to be open until later. But for those of you who have been in your quarantine and not meeting any random people, I highly recommend joining us because you get to meet random people. And that's all fun because we're all interested in the same stuff, right? Okay, so a little housekeeping. We want to make sure that you put your questions in the question box below. So if you can look right directly under me, should be a little thing that says ask a question. If you have a question for any of the speakers on any of the topics, you want to put your question there. And what's happening is people can vote each other's questions up. So you want to check into that box throughout the conversation, vote the questions that are exciting for you. Make sure to put them there instead of the comments because the comments might get lost. Let's see. And speaking of comments, keep them respectful. If there's any issues, we're going to give you a warning and remove anyone if necessary. And lastly, as soon as this event is over, you can watch this as it's recording and it will be available on the same link. All right, so let's start with introducing and sharing the bios of our guests. So I'm going to invite Ann Harrison, also known as Annie Oak, to join us. She's the managing editor and co-founder of Lucid News. Together with Mike Margolies, she wrote the story about President Biden's promising reform of his punitive drug laws that helped spark this conversation. Anne covers politics, business, and science for Lucid News and has spent many years reporting on the drug war. Thanks for joining us, Annie. Next, we have Maritza Perez. She's the director of the Office of National Affairs at the Drug Policy Alliance in Washington, D.C., where she leads the organization's federal legislative agenda and strategy to end the war on drugs. I want to also invite you guys all to unmute yourself in case you're muted. Previously, Maritza was a senior policy analyst for criminal justice reform at the Center for American Progress, CAP, where her portfolio included marijuana policy, policing, and prison and sentencing reform. Prior to joining CAP, Maritza was a legislative staff attorney at the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF, where she started her legal career as a Soros Justice Fellow, advocating for policies to end mass incarceration. Thanks for joining us, Maritza. Next, we have Mitchell Gomez, who is a graduate of New College of Florida, whose alumni included the founders of Arrowwood Maps and the Zendo Project. And he has his master's from CU Denver. Mitchell joined DanceSafe as their national outreach director in 2014 and was promoted to executive director in March 2017. He has volunteered with the Burning Man organization, SSDP, and other small harm reduction projects for many years and is a passionate advocate for reality-based drug policy and harm reduction. Thanks for joining us, Mitchell. Lastly, but not least, we have Mike Margolies, who's the founder of Psychedelic Seminars, which you are all joining us on, an event and media producer, journalist, connector, and advisor who has interviewed the likes of Michael Pollan, James Fadiman, Ayelet Waldman. He has seeded the Baltimore Psychedelic Society and has sparked and mentored similar groups around the world from San Francisco to DC to Portugal. Mike is also the co-founder of the Crypto Psychedelic Summit, which has a really cool event coming up pretty soon. All right, that's it for me. You guys take it away.
Thanks, Mareesa. And yeah, thank all of you, and thank everyone for being here. I'm really excited for this event here. As Mareesa mentioned, Annie and I wrote an article recently covering Biden's past in drug policy and also his future promises. And that's sort of the rough arc that we wanted to follow here today, is kind of, now that we're a week into his presidency, we want to look at contextualize things on what's the history here. He was an architect of a lot of pretty bad drug policy historically. However, in more recent years, and particularly on the campaign trail and on his current campaign or his current website outlining what he's promised, he's making a lot of promises for reform. So we want to go over that too, and also kind of keep him to task on that. And that's the broad arc. But we've got a lot of great folks here, and we're going to do this roundtable style, starting off with the first piece of the history. And anyone who wants to, feel free to popcorn style jump in here as we're going to go through. Biden has a whole history of supporting and in many times being the chief author or one of the authors of a lot of legislation that we now know today as some of the worst stuff of the drug war. Some of it's pretty infamous, actually. And we can go through that first. And if you're following along, Mareesa previously sent the article. I'll put another link down here. There it is. So you can follow along here. And Annie, Mitchell, Maritza, feel free to chime in as far as what Biden's done historically. We go all the way back to the 80s here, right? Where Biden was the driving force behind, for example, the 1984 Comprehensive Control Act. And that was expanding the penalties for drug crimes and also infamously created this civil asset forfeiture here. And Annie, I know you have a lot to say about civil asset forfeiture. You're muted. Here, I'll help you out.
Forfeiture is a process by which you might be accused of a drug crime and your assets are seized by, in some cases, local authorities, local police, before you are tried or even convicted of a crime. And this action made a lot of people very angry for some obvious reasons. It felt to many people that it was unconstitutional. You're not guilty of a crime. You're not found guilty. You haven't even gone through the process of being tried. And yet somebody might seize your car or other property. So when this happened, especially in a town where you might be accused of a drug crime and suddenly you see the local authorities, the local police driving your car, which they have seized in a civil asset forfeiture seizure, that made people very angry, and there was a lot of pushback against this.
Yeah, and it kind of goes against the idea of, not to be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, right? Civil asset forfeiture, that you have to prove that it wasn't whatever, car you got or money you have was not obtained illegally. It's a big issue. I'm sure you have, Maritza, Mitch, you probably find to say around it.
Maritza, did you want to jump in first, or
go for it?
So I think the big question a lot of people have is how this is legal, and the way it's legal is that they charge your property, they don't charge you, right? So you'll actually see court cases like State of New York versus $100,000 in cash, and so property does not have this presumption of innocence that people have under U.S. law. I think we all recognize that's nonsense, right? Like the $100,000 obviously belongs to somebody, and that person should have those rights. But it's a rather clever workaround for the protections against unlawful search and seizure that are granted to us under the Constitution. I think probably the most important thing to know about civil asset forfeiture is it now outnumbers all other types of robbery combined. So if you want to look at like what most robbery looks like in this country, the average robbery in terms of dollar amount is police showing up at your house and taking your things without you ever being convicted of a crime. That outnumbers all other armed robbery, fraud, theft, if you take everything that's sort of classed as like theft and put it in one pile, civil asset forfeiture is now a larger pile than all of that combined. And it's become sort of a primary funding tool for local law enforcement. It's how these agencies continue to operate. And so yeah, it's a big problem and one that's going to be really tough to divest from, just from like a purely financial standpoint. There's a lot of people whose paychecks and whose ability to operate as like a law enforcement agency is now dependent on civil asset forfeiture.
Yeah, one interesting thing I think is that I think right now we're at a unique moment where there might be some more momentum to at least rein in civil asset forfeiture. I know that was something some members of Congress were interested in doing in the last congressional session, but it just didn't happen. But I think it's something that DPA is definitely going to push for again in this congressional session in the 117th Congress. It's an area where there's actually bipartisan support, which is very unlike a lot of other things that go through the Capitol. But it also falls in line with the moment right now where people are asking that we defund the police. I mean, we, of course, depending on who your audience is, but that's essentially what we're talking about when we're saying end civil asset forfeiture. It's defunding the police and those problematic funding streams that actually just serve to militarize the police even further. Something that we've also been working on is just demilitarizing the police. And a lot of these funding streams were actually created through legislation that passed in the 80s and 90s, either authored or endorsed by Joe Biden himself. So he's put himself in a really awkward position where he's going to have to hold himself accountable to the folks that voted him in, Black and brown people, activists, advocates. And, I think he feels that he needs to because of the base that voted him in, but also because I do think that, we've done a good job of educating the public on these issues, and I feel like he needs to respond to it. Things are changing.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. We have to hold him accountable, right? Because Biden, being one of the architects of this, allowing this thing that's, in my opinion, I don't really know how the legal argument holds weight. That's I didn't actually know that tidbit, Mitch, but that's very interesting that actually holds up. And if Biden being one of the people that made this happen, he does need to be held accountable to change these things. And
this is another case where we've seen mission creep, right? Where originally this was written as the way this was talked about. If you look at the footage of this legislation being debated, which is worth doing, by the way, it's interesting debates. They talked about it as going after drug lords, right? That's how they were talking about it, right? These guys who are amassing hundreds of millions of dollars in cash, and they have planes and boats. And I've seen civil asset forfeiture cases for as low as $50 now, where they found $50 in someone's pocket and just seized that money from them. And obviously at that point, going to court and fighting for your $50 doesn't make any sense. I mean, just from a financial standpoint. And so, yeah, we've seen a lot of sort of, maybe mission creep isn't the word I'm looking for, but an expansion of that way beyond what legislators were sort of debating at the time.
It's also affected a lot of families, right? You could have your house seized. You could have your bank account seized. You're not able to take care of your family properly. You could lose your business as a secondary impact on this. It has had a terrible impact on people's ability to really function while they're fighting a case in court. Maybe they can't hire their lawyer. Maybe they don't have access to their funds to properly defend themselves. Maybe they've been pushed out of their house. I mean, it has had immediate impact on people for years. And I think Mitchell is right about expecting pushback from law enforcement organizations that are accustomed to getting this source of funding to be able to pay people in their departments and support their budgets, especially at a time now when there's so much pressure on municipal budgets across the country due to the pandemic, et cetera. I think we can expect to see some pushback from law enforcement.
Yeah, and on this, what you're referring to as mission creep there, and this is a really interesting point, right? Because this is pretty typical. There's always some story when a piece of legislation is passed, and it's always a really big, scary baddie that we're fighting against. But then in practice, the laws end up being used against generally the most marginalized people. And this is sort of thinking about the Patriot Act, right? We had to fight the big baddie of terrorism, and then of course, obviously, how this becomes abused. And I'm concerned. This is on a little bit of a tangent from drug war specifically, but if we look at what people are calling for now after what happened at the Capitol, it's, oh, we need new laws for domestic terrorism. And it sounds good at first, but then you think about it and it's like, wait a minute, how are these laws actually going to be used? And do we really need new laws, or do we just need to be holding people accountable to the existing laws? Maritza, you look like you have something to say on this.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's unrelated at all, because we're still ultimately talking about policing, and police budgets and police equipment is used in pursuit of the drug war. So I see it all as interrelated. At the federal level, we have been making a push to get away from exactly what you were describing, from getting away from this call to create more laws, because we know what the outcomes of that always end up being. As you said, it's marginalized communities who feel the brunt of those laws. One example that comes to mind that's actually really timely and relevant right now is the crack cocaine disparity. So this was another thing that Joe Biden was responsible for in the 80s, by building out a law that was really supposed to, they claim, curb violence in communities and stop people from using crack. But what ended up happening was they created this disparity where, scientists were all saying that crack, which was people thought used mostly by Black people, was more problematic and harmful to a person's body. And they justified, versus cocaine. And they justified that by making it so that individuals who were caught distributing crack were sentenced way more harshly than people who were caught using or distributing powder cocaine, which was correlated with use by white people, but actually white people use cocaine and crack more than Black people. But when this sentencing disparity and the sentencing policy actually, came into law, it's Black individuals who were criminalized for it. And we see the same thing happening now with fentanyl. So, fentanyl analogs have been in the news a lot. And, Congress is again reverting to this tough on crime narrative when it comes to fentanyl. We all should be alarmed by the overdose crisis right now. And a lot of that is connected to fentanyl and fentanyl being included in drugs. But Congress's response to that, rather than learning from the past and going a public health approach, now they're saying, oh, we just need to schedule all fentanyl analogs and fentanyl itself as Schedule I drugs. And they have been doing that, and they have been aggressively prosecuting these cases. But it's been people on the lower levels of drug distribution chains, Black and brown people, who have been the ones being sentenced under these fentanyl laws. So I hate to say it, but I feel like I think the public is becoming more educated on these issues, but Congress hasn't moved a whole lot. We're still trying to impress upon them the need to have a public health approach versus a criminal justice approach. But one ray of hope with all of this is that Joe Biden has publicly said that he intends to completely eliminate the sentencing disparity between crack cocaine offenses. And tomorrow, in fact, Senator Brooker is introducing a bill alongside Senator Durbin called the Equal Act that would totally eliminate the disparity and make that retroactive so that individuals who are currently serving time have an opportunity to come before a judge and have their sentence revisited.
I just want to interject really quick. We have a question of which piece of legislation introduces the civil asset forfeiture, just so people can follow along with you guys.
Yes, that is the 1984 Comprehensive Control Act. So if you're following along in the Lucid News article, it's kind of in the third paragraph there, and we can include a link here in the chat, actually.
So one tiny point of correction is that civil asset forfeiture existed in the 1930s during alcohol prohibition, but it required conviction, right? You had to be arrested and convicted before they could seize your whatever, your house, your car, your proceeds. The bill you just referenced is what made it so that they could, it created this ability to charge the item, right? Which is really a different thing. I actually am not blanket opposed to the idea of asset forfeiture for proceeds of a crime. I think that there might be a place for that within our legal system, looking at hedge funds. But what we need is a conviction before that happens, right? You can't just charge the person's car or their bank account, seize their money, and then they can't hire an attorney to fight against it. That's absurd. But yeah, civil forfeiture existed in the 30s as well. It was born out of alcohol prohibition. And so, yeah, it's an old practice. It just used to actually require, following the Fourth Amendment.
Yeah, and the other piece of legislation that we also referenced was related to the 100-to-1 disparity. That's the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which I will also link here. And that particular one, that was sponsored and partially written by Biden. So, all the stuff we're talking about here, right? Civil asset forfeiture, 100-to-1, crack to cocaine disparity. These are currently existing punitive drug laws and policies that Biden himself was a driver behind. And so this is, really important to note here. There was a follow-up actually as well to the in 1988, another Anti-Drug Abuse Act, and that further increased penalties for possession and transportation, established the Office of National Drug Control Policy. And then there's a really famous one, actually I'll pause there before we get to maybe the most famous one, the RAVE Act. Were there other comments that any of you wanted to say about the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts or the Comprehensive Control Act?
Yeah, I have a comment. During the final presidential debate, when challenged on his drug policy record and the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 and then later 1988, Biden admitted plainly that the legislation needed to be rewritten. And here's a quote: "It was a mistake," said Biden. "I've been trying to change it since then, particularly the portion on cocaine." There was a section on Biden's campaign website dedicated to, and again, this is a quote, "eliminating racial disparities and ensuring fair sentences," that specifically committed to ending once and for all the federal crack and powder cocaine disparity, and to ensure that this change is applied retroactively. So the Biden campaign really focused on this issue. They made promises during the campaign itself, and it's interesting to see them beginning to move on this, as Maritza said, and we'll see what happens. We need to hold them accountable. Yeah,
good point. Biden, both in the debates and on his website, has made this promise to correct the error that he made. He made the mistake and has committed to changing it. And we do need to hold him to that.
Biden also noted that he claimed that it was medical professionals, which is interesting, who convinced lawmakers that crack cocaine was more dangerous without considering, who was using that form of cocaine. And he claimed that at the time we had this extensive medical testimony, according to Biden, talking about the particularly addictive nature of crack versus powder cocaine. And this is a quote, "And the school of thought was that we had to do everything we could to dissuade the use of crack cocaine. And so I am part of the problem that I have been trying to solve since then, because I think the disparity is way out of line." So he acknowledges this disparity. And it's also interesting to see the medical profession be involved in justifying this legislation.
Yeah. I'm wondering.
So, this is the thing. Oh, sorry.
No, go for it.
I was just going to say that dynamic where junk science is used to justify bad legislation, and then, later sort of updates to the science, or in some cases outright retractions of the science, doesn't get the headlines, doesn't get the legislation changed. It happened with MDMA, right? The MDMA holes in the brain study, where they actually changed the contrast on the MRI machines. The MDMA causes death in 80% of its users study, where it turned out they'd been injecting the monkeys with, pure methamphetamine at really, really, really high doses, because they claimed they had mixed up 2 jars, which I still believe was just an outright act of drug war propaganda. I don't believe those scientists mixed up those jars at all. And then, you know, the legislation stays the same, right? I mean, that was the original sort of impetus behind the Rave Act, was this science that showed these holes in the brains from really low dose MDMA use, and the science that showed these massive deaths. And I remember at the time, I mean, I was, you know, maybe 16 years old. And I remember even at that point thinking, like, if MDMA caused 80% of the users to die, I wouldn't have any friends left, right? Like, I immediately knew that study was nonsense just from like looking at my social circles. And so, yeah, you saw that with crack cocaine as well, right? I mean, it's everybody who was a drug user at that time knew these studies were junk, but the drug war stigma is so strong that, you know, speaking out as a drug user and saying, look, like, I know that crack doesn't do this because I'm a doctor who on weekends uses crack, right? Which is a real dynamic. There are definitely doctors out there who have used crack cocaine. We know that for an absolute fact. And so, yeah, the sort of destigmatization of these drugs, I think, is a big part of what we need to be pushing for here, so that people can speak out honestly about their own experiences with drug use. Because drug users, by and large, like, they know what they're doing, and they have a lot of data that can be shared with, you know, epidemiologists and public health professionals, if they're not, you know, afraid to talk.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'm wondering, do you think that, you know, so Biden made this claim that he got this information from doctors. Do you think they were knowingly, you know, giving misinformation, or was this a real honest mistake?
I mean, I think if your funding is dependent on NIDA grants, you have a lot of financial self-interest in supporting the drug war.
I'd like to talk about drug users for a second. You know, there's been a lot of commentary about whether Biden's position on drugs has been influenced by his son Hunter Biden's very public struggle with addiction. According to news reports, Hunter Biden has been in rehab at least 6 times for drugs and alcohol. He told the New York Times that he spent 4 years addicted to crack cocaine and has been in rehab 7 or 8 times. There have also been reports that Hunter Biden underwent Ibogaine therapy in Mexico, which is interesting to see. And so, of course, one wonders about a double standard, right, for the son of a politician, and also whether or not this impacted Biden's own thinking about drug users and the use of cocaine in particular. One must wonder, right?
Yeah, then there's definitely a double standard, right? I mean, particularly on racial lines. Mm-hmm. And people are having different attitudes about drugs like heroin, right? Once white people started having this heroin epidemic, became a white thing, the attitudes started changing. And you know, even more so, of course, there's a double standard if you're a politician. So there's definitely class and race double standard and triple standards for all of these things. I'm sure, Maritza, you probably have plenty to say on this.
Yeah, no, I just think that this conversation is really important just to understand the context that we're in today. I'm just like watching the audience chat. But, you know, the same tactics that were used to create these laws impact the laws that we have in place today, particularly around how we're addressing the opioid crisis and fentanyl. On fentanyl, we're taking a really aggressive approach. On opioids, we're taking a different approach, but, you know, the face of the opioid crisis is white, and that does make a difference with lawmakers, you know, where they've been pursuing a more compassionate approach there. So this conversation is still totally relevant for that reason. And then plus the fact that there are still people serving time for these offenses, people who have been incarcerated for years, for decades, that I would like to see come home to their families.
Yeah, and you know, I think a big part of this is that, you know, the impetus is, oh, if we just increase the laws enough around fentanyl, then we can stamp out fentanyl, right? But the reality is most users find fentanyl less euphoric than heroin. Not all. There are some users who prefer fentanyl. I don't want to dismiss those users. But most opioid users have described fentanyl as less euphoric than heroin, which means that there's not a market-driven reason to increase fentanyl in the drug supply. The reason that fentanyl is so prevalent is that it's easier to smuggle than heroin, right? And you can't, I often like to sort of phrase this as you can't arrest your way out of a problem that you arrested your way into. If you increase the penalties for fentanyl analogs, you're simply encouraging distributors to switch to more potent analogs. Right? If the penalty per gram goes up for the analogs, well then like, okay, so we'll switch from fentanyl to carfentanil and now we get more doses per gram. Or we switch to 4-fluorobutafentanil, which is a full order of magnitude stronger than carfentanil, right? So now we have, 100,000 potential doses per gram of powder. And so, yeah, increasing penalties on these substances just encourages people to switch to more potent analogs. That's the market response to increasing penalties on these drugs, is how much more potent can we make these things so that it's easier to smuggle, less risk of getting caught, easier to distribute. And so, yeah, I don't see a punitive law enforcement solution to these problems, particularly when fentanyl is not a particularly difficult substance to synthesize. Once you get your hands on the precursors, I was part of a webcast that the DEA was doing about new fentanyl production methods. It was not something that I feel like should have been broadcast, but it was, so I watched it. And like I have a year and a half of organic chemistry, and they got to the end of the synthesis and it was like, yeah, I could do that. Like with a year and a half of undergrad, like I understood every step of the process. I understood what was going on. It was like, this is not difficult chemistry. This is a really easy drug to synthesize. And so like, I just don't see it being, legislated out of existence.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I mean, I guess that comes to the next question of like, what is the right approach? And I think one of the answers we would get to point to is drug checking, right? Which I know, of course, you're doing a lot of work with DanceSafe around. Is actually segues neatly as well to the other big piece of legislation that Biden was a champion of, which was, of course, the RAVE Act, and which has had a major effect on drug checking being accessible. And so for those who, were you going to say something, Mitch?
Oh, I mean, yeah, but you finish your thing. Okay, I just was unmuting. If we're talking about the RAVE Act, I got to unmute, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, definitely going to get your thoughts on the RAVE Act. And so for those who aren't totally familiar with the RAVE Act, so there was actually an initial piece of legislation that was from 2002, and the RAVE Act stands for the Reducing Americans' Vulnerability to Ecstasy, which is kind of ironic because it, in fact, increased vulnerability to ecstasy and other drugs. The original RAVE Act that was called the RAVE Act in 2002 actually did not pass, but there was the following year, the Illicit Drug Anti-Proliferation Act, and basically the same language that was in the original RAVE Act was put into that. And this was passed as an attachment to the Amber Alert bill in 2003. So people still refer to this even though it wasn't actually entitled the RAVE Act anymore, we still kind of refer to it colloquially as the RAVE Act, and we'll call it the RAVE Act here because it's just it's an easy way to refer to it. Basically what happened, and maybe Mitch, do you want to explain this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to know about the RAVE Act. I've definitely can and have talked about that subject alone for 2 hours. I think the two big things to know is that it's a very poorly written law. It's just vaguely written. It's not very clear what the law was intended to do. It has language like if a person is, promoting substance use at their event, or if an event is held for the purpose of substance use, and they don't define these terms. And so it makes promoters really, really, really hesitant to do anything that could be seen as sort of being pro-drug use at their events.
And it was based off of crack house laws, right?
Right, so it was based off of crack house laws. It was an expansion of the U.S. crack house laws. I think the other important part is that there has never been a successful prosecution under the RAVE Act, except for cases where people were also involved directly in the drug trade at their own events. Right, so there have been people who've been charged under the RAVE Act and took plea deals. They were not actually convicted under the Anti-Drug Proliferation Act, to my knowledge. But those people were all people who were involved directly in drug distribution at their events. And so when that happens, the DEA tends to just take a spaghetti approach. They throw every charge they can at the person to try to get them to take a plea deal. Right, if you're facing 650 years in jail and they come and they offer you a 20-year plea deal, like, yeah, you're going to take the 20-year plea. it's just a poorly written law. And I used to talk a lot about amending the RAVE Act to allow for the existence of harm reduction. At this point, I genuinely think that a better solution is to repeal both the U.S. Anti-Drug Proliferation Act and the federal crack house laws. I don't think either of those laws are appropriate uses of law enforcement. And I just think that they cause far more harm than they do good.
Yeah, and just for more context for folks here, what the RAVE Act does is it essentially says, yeah, if you are found to be housing a place where people are using drugs, it could be interpreted, let's say, that if you have a party or you're an event where people are using drugs, that you're accountable for that. And at least that's how it's being interpreted by a lot of event promoters. And so there's this fear that if you were to, for example, have Mitch come to your event and do DanceSafe and test people's substances, do drug checking to keep people safe, check for things like fentanyl, right? Event promoters have a fear that if they have a DanceSafe booth, for example, that, oh, well, now we're admitting that we're a place for people to do drugs. And so a lot of event promoters don't want to have these kinds of services like drug checking at their events because they're worried about being prosecuted. Now, as Mitch pointed out, in practice, it hasn't really been used in this way, but that's sort of the fear that's pervading. There was a whole campaign, an Amend the RAVE Act campaign. Dee Dee Goldsmith was spearheading that after her daughter tragically died at an event in DC. And this is it was at a venue and they didn't have water available. There was all kinds of unsafe conditions in this particular environment. And there was a whole campaign that she led as a mother to try to make sure that that parties could have safer conditions. Ultimately, the RAVE Act itself wasn't actually amended, but there was a clarifying letter that came from the DEA saying, okay, yeah, the letter says this isn't the purpose, but still the law is out there and it's still a poorly written law, as Mitchell pointed out here.
I
think, so we stepped down from running this, but we've taken over. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, again, if you go back to the record and you see what Biden has said about the RAVE Act, he said during a 2001 Senate hearing that, arrest the promoter, find a rationale unrelated to drugs. It's very clear how he wanted to use this legislation to target event producers and promoters. I'm an event producer. And I know that it has had a chilling effect on event producers who want to include risk reduction, drug checking services at their events. We'll also say that it has impacted owners of venues that event producers want to rent for their events. If you are an event producer and you go to a venue and you say, we want to have drug checking at our event, some venues push back and say, well, we don't want to get caught up in being persecuted with this legislation. So it has a compounding chilling effect and has had this over the years. And sometimes you need to go to that venue and say, it is a moral obligation to provide drug checking at events and it saves lives and we must do this. Please be on board with us. So it's had a wide impact, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah, and two interesting things have actually happened recently that I think are worth mentioning. The first is that letter that was given to Dee Dee from the Drug Enforcement Agency that explicitly said the presence of health services would not be used as interpreted as part of a RAVE Act prosecution. It's a pretty broadly written letter, but so is the RAVE Act's a pretty broadly written law, so we can talk about broadness on both sides. And also just recently, the CDC has come out and officially recommended drug checking as a way of dealing with the opioid epidemic. And so we now have a federal agency that is explicitly saying, hey, like there's this problem, drug checking is the solution. And so I think that it would be very, very hard for a district attorney at this point to come in, arrest, a promoter and say, look, these people were providing drug checking services. When the CDC has said they should do it, we're in the midst of this opioid crisis. I think a DA would be very, very hesitant to take that on and to do that. These people are trying to stop fentanyl deaths, so we came in and arrested them. It's such a great way to lose your next election as DA that I can't even overstress it. That would just be the end of your career as a federal prosecutor. And so, yeah, there is this sort of progress that's being made. But I do also want to say that the reason DanceSafe exists, the reason that drug checking exists, the reason we have to do this is because of prohibition. Right? In legal regulated marketplaces, our services are completely unnecessary. And even under prohibition, realistically, most of what DanceSafe does should be provided by community health clinics that are funded by tax dollars. Right? There should be public drop-in drug checking services at every community health clinic and every county in the country, where people could bring their drugs in, get them tested. They would be able to, run them through GCMS or FTIR, really advanced laboratory testing. And that should be just the sort of public health norm for any civilized country that insists on continuing prohibition. And then the ultimate solution is just to end prohibition, and these problems absolutely vanish. I mean, these problems just don't exist. I often say 5% of what DanceSafe does is drug harm reduction. It's 95% drug prohibition harm reduction. And that is so frustrating to have this massive problem that you could literally solve it overnight. But that's sort of where we're at. But I think that's worth mentioning, that this is not intrinsic to drug markets, right? There's a reason that when you buy 3.5% beer, you don't worry about there being fentanyl in it. And there's a reason that you don't have to worry about methanol in your beer causing blindness, which happened to tens of thousands of Americans in the late 1930s. Tens of thousands of Americans went blind drinking black market alcohols in this country. And that's not a problem anymore because we solved that problem.
We're still trying to get safe injection and safe use sites here in San Francisco. That's been a struggle for a long time, and we would like to see that happen. Speaking as a resident, I know a lot of people are pushing for that, and our Department of Public Health as well.
Yeah, and and maybe now this is a good segue to where are we going from here, right? Because we've covered pretty well a lot of this, a lot of the existing drug policy that Biden was behind that got us into some not nice places where we are. But he has changed his tune, right? Even though we have a lot, like Annie, you alluded to this. And there's a video actually we have as well of Biden saying, it was 20 years ago, but him saying, oh yeah, go in there and arrest the promoter. And he's very smugly talking about all this. And that's within the Lucid News right back to article. You can find the link there as well. That was 20 years ago, right? And let's say, let's maybe cautiously, optimistically give him some benefit of the doubt here. I would like to think that he's being truthful when he says that, okay, I made a mistake and I want to change this. And that is what he's done more recently. As we already alluded to earlier at the presidential debates, he said this, and on his website, he's made very specific promises to change these, including, as we already covered, the crack house law, but and several other promises, such as ending private prisons, which there was an executive order just yesterday to not renew contracts with private prisons for the DOJ.
Yeah, and Biden has also come out in favor of what he's calling drug courts as an alternative to incarceration. According to his campaign website, he intends to end all incarceration for drug use alone, and that's a quote, and instead divert individuals to drug courts and treatment. So he's shifting over to this treatment language, this approach. There are, however, some issues with drug courts, and we wrote about this in our story that Mike and I wrote. And I think we need to take a careful look at, what are the problems with drug courts if this is going to be the next initiative for the Biden administration. And, some people have referred to drug courts as, the kinder and gentler war on drugs, right? So let's unpack, a little bit what some of the issues are with drug courts. We, in our story, took a look at this. Some of our sources did. And, there's a perspective that no one should have to get arrested and plead guilty to a drug charge in order to get access to treatment. And which, if they do not complete to the satisfaction of the court, can then lead them to incarceration. So drug courts are built upon the premise that treatment should be kind of completed in exchange for freedom. You know, like what other health condition is treated this way? I think that's an important point to make.
Yeah, I think that's right. I feel like drug courts are going to be a huge battle with this administration, just because anytime I feel like Joe Biden's asked a question about drugs, he'll revert back to, well, nobody should go to jail for drugs, but, you know, we'll offer drug courts. And that's a real problem, because drug courts, that's not treatment. That's just an extension of the criminal justice system. That is more surveillance on people. That is more like mandated programming. And for a lot of people, drug courts actually funnel people into the criminal justice system, especially people who may not be able to complete the program requirements, who may not be able to abstain, who may not be able to pursue abstinence, who may not be able to find even rides or meet other requisites that drug courts require. So I'm thinking of like low-income individuals, people who might not have the best access to transportation. Drug courts are a huge issue, and I'm really scared that he's embraced them, because I think that's going to have to be something that we're going to have to like educate not just the administration but members of Congress on, saying like, no, we shouldn't be investing in drug courts. What we should be doing is actually investing in harm reduction services and treatment and other systems outside of the criminal legal system. So that really scares me. And you know, while he has changed his tune to an extent, we're still dealing with a very, very moderate president. Even his executive orders that have come down this week, you know, have been fine, all right, but it hasn't been anything bold, anything that we would, you know, applaud him for. To give just a couple of examples, he, you know, one of his first executive orders was this moratorium on deportations. It was a 100-day moratorium on deportations of non-citizens. Yet he reverted to Obama's felons, not families policy, where people with convictions weren't granted any sort of amnesty. I mean, they essentially can still be deported and are still caught up in the immigration system. And then, you know, just yesterday, he produced an EO on private prisons, but that was really just, again, reverting back to an Obama policy where he stopped contracting with private contractors at the federal level, which sounds great, but that's a drop in the bucket when we're talking about the incarcerated population. There's only 12 such facilities in the entire federal prison system. Private prison industry is really getting their money from immigrant detention, where most non-citizens, or a majority, or we're reaching a majority of non-citizens, are actually housed in private facilities on immigration violations. But then also at the state and local level, we have, you know, towns who are looking for revenue, who are looking for jobs. These private prisons come in and set up shop, and they have to fill those jail cells. They're filling those cells with people who use drugs, with non-citizens, with other people convicted of low-level offenses. So I don't know, you know, I also like want to be optimistic, and I am in some respects, but I'm also frustrated because everything we're getting is not enough, especially at such an urgent time. You know, we have to deal with, I understand we have to unravel all of the damage that's been done in the last 4 years, but we're also living through a pandemic. We've also have recently, you know, just this summer saw a racial uprising, and I don't think that we've responded to any of those things with the urgency that's required. Like, you know, Trump certainly did not meet the moment at all. And this administration just isn't there yet. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. That's a really good point, you know, because yes, on the one hand, it's nice that Biden is saying, okay, I made mistakes, and he seems to be making progress, saying no one should be in jail for drugs. And at the same time, it's still not quite all the way there, right? Talking about non-consensual treatment and drug courts and all this stuff, it's still not really quite getting it. It's still not respecting people's agency. It's still using the same tools of criminalization. So is it a step in the right direction? Sure, though it's definitely not far enough for where we really want to be.
And I think the other really important point here is that the DPA has done I know there's some stuff on your guys' website where you've pulled the data from like the DEA's estimates of what percentage of various substance users meet the DSM criteria for problematic substance use. And even for the drugs that people think of as like really, really, really problematic, you know, things like cocaine and heroin, it's like 74%, 76% don't meet the DSM criteria for problematic substance use, right? Which means just like definitionally they're recreational users. And like, we don't talk about, you know, recreational heroin use as a thing that's real, but it is. I mean, just like medically, this is like, that's a fact. Like most people who use heroin do not meet the criteria for problematic substance use. They are not, you know, addicts in the old language. And so like, those people do not need to be forced into treatment. They need to be left alone by armed agents of the state. Like they just need to like not be forced to do anything if they, you know, but also, you know, if we roll back prohibition, hopefully people would be getting caught up less in the criminal justice system, right? If the police aren't actively looking for, you see this in Portugal all the time, right? Where if the police are not actively looking for drugs and they have found you with drugs 3 times, like in Portugal, you have to go in front of a panel, there's a judge and a mental health professional. But it's like, if the police aren't looking for drugs and they found your drugs 3 times, there are other things going on, right? Like there's other things happening in your life that have caused you to come in contact with law enforcement multiple times. And so like, maybe you should talk to, you know, mental health professionals or, you know, so there's that side of it as well. But no, I really worry about this forced treatment idea, because the vast majority of drug users that I've known throughout my life have not needed to be forced into treatment. They've needed to be left alone.
Yeah, and I'd like to parse out actually 2 points you made there. And one is that for people who do have a relationship with substances that you know, might not be helpful for their life, like you said, it's not the drug that's the root cause here, right? It's something deeper. So to address them as though it's the drug, you know, having a drug addiction is the root cause of all their problems is really missing the point. It's not actually giving them the support they need. And then on the other hand, for people who are using a substance but don't have any kind of relationship with the substance that's a problem for them, we still treat them in this model as though they, oh, well, you have addiction. Everyone who uses this drug must have addiction to it, which is not the case, right? It just takes away the whole idea of agency, the idea that a human might choose to use a substance. And I think almost, and this is the, you know, the dirty little secret that almost everybody shares, is we all use drugs, right? And we all pretend like we don't use drugs in this model, but pretty much everybody uses drugs, and most people who use drugs don't have necessarily a problematic relationship, and oftentimes the drugs that people have problematic relationships with, it's probably the ones that are available, like alcohol, very legally and easily, and we don't really talk about this very well.
I'd like to make sure that we, before this hour is done, talk about the MORE Act. This is an important piece of legislation. Coming up, the House of Representatives has passed the MORE Act, which calls for federal decriminalization of cannabis. And if passed, the MORE Act could really set the stage for the reform of federal law governing other substances as well. It's an important piece of legislation. Most Republicans opposed the bill, but with Republicans losing their majority in Congress, it now goes to the Senate, and it could well pass. It's very exciting.
Yeah, so this is a bill that the Drug Policy Alliance has been leading alongside other groups, including NORML, Students for Accessible Drug Policy. We've built a broad coalition of folks who are in support of this bill, from the civil rights space, traditional drug policy groups, the labor movement, veterans, all sorts of folks. But the bill would deschedule marijuana. It would provide for community reinvestment so that marijuana tax revenue would be used to fund social services in communities most harmed by the war on drugs. It would also provide for the resentencing and expungement of marijuana offenses. It would give states funding to do the same. It would provide programming within the Small Business Administration to make sure that people of color and other people who have historically been left out of the cannabis industry find their footing in the industry, if that's what they choose to do. In addition to other things, it's a really comprehensive bill, and we were really excited that it made it through the House last year. The goal for this year is to reintroduce the bill in both chambers and hopefully get it signed into law That said, we were encouraged by the Georgia Senate races flipping to Democratic seats, because that means we have a Democratic leader, and Senator Schumer has been very supportive of marijuana reform and the MORE Act itself, which is great. But it's still going to be very challenging. Both sides of the aisle, we know, have been really, really bad on drug policy. Even something as popular as marijuana, where the public, is in full support, still, we still have a lot of work to do with Congress, unfortunately. And then there's, again, Joe Biden, who hasn't embraced descheduling at all, as the MORE Act would do. He is all about resentencing. There is a glimmer of hope in the fact that Vice President Kamala Harris was the lead in the Senate last year of the MORE Act, so hopefully she can influence him a bit there. But all of that said, I think we still have our work cut out for us. But in addition to the MORE Act this year, I do want to share with people who are listening that we also intend to introduce a federal drug decriminalization bill, decriminalizing possession of all drugs. We're really excited about that. This would be the first bill of its kind, at least at the federal level. Legislation takes time, but we have to start doing the work now to really build political education and political will to do this, hopefully in the near future. DPA actually worked on the recently passed ballot initiative in Oregon that decriminalized all drugs and reinvest savings from the criminal legal system back into treatment. So we think that's a great model. We're working with other states around the country to start conversations around doing something similar there in other places, but we also want to see something done at the federal level. So that's really exciting stuff that we're working on that I wanted to share.
Yeah, thanks. That's really exciting. And, and presumably, Biden does say on his website that he did make a commitment to decriminalize cannabis. And he has made these statements about no one should be going to jail for drugs. So presumably these should be things that he would support. We'll see if he actually follows through on that.
Yeah, we will see. We might see soon too, because we do know that there will be an executive order coming down. There's 2 more criminal justice related executive orders that we expect from this administration related to things that we were talking about today. So one is an executive order around the 1033 program. So this is a program ran through the Department of Defense that allows local law enforcement to receive military grade equipment. Obama reined in the program. Of course, Trump let it reign free. We imagine that whatever EO executive order will come down will probably be reverting back to Obama's safeguards and restrictions around the program. At DPA, we would like to see the program completely abolished. But again, we're dealing with Biden. And then he also announced that we should expect an EO anytime, before Monday, around prosecutorial discretion at the federal level, as well as sentencing. So because of his past statements on marijuana, I wonder if that's what it could be. Could it be something else? Will it be reinstating the Cole memo at the DOJ? I really don't know. So I'm really curious to see what it is. I imagine, I could be wrong, that it would, but I do think it might have something to do with drug offenses, and how narrow it'll be, I don't know. But maybe I'm just being really optimistic. I don't know. This is all a guessing game.
Yeah, thanks. I think we're about ready to start taking questions. Unless there's any things we didn't cover already that any of you wanted to share. Is there anything specific that we want to do before questions?
I'd like to thank you very much, Maritza, for explaining the leadership that DPA is taking here. I think it's important for people to know that. What should regular folks do to help support the MORE Act and other progressive drug policies? What kind of action should people be taking?
I would encourage people who are interested in this issue to just follow the Drug Policy Alliance on social media and subscribe to our website. If you go to our website, there's a way to subscribe to our messaging. But if you do that, you'll get action alerts about all the different legislative activity that we're working on. And that really is effective. I cannot underscore how effective it is when lawmakers hear from constituents. Because us, you know, as advocates, we can go in all day and talk to them, but they'll never give us the same credibility they give people who are directly impacted, people who use drugs, people who deeply care about these issues, people who are their actual constituents. They carry a lot of weight too. So I think if you want to get involved, that's one way to do it, by just, you know, interacting and taking up these groups when they say like, hey, we need you to do this or do that, like take us up on that and get involved.
I've been shocked. So I've really only started dipping my toes into like lobbying in the last few years. You know, DanceSafe removed the test kits from the paraphernalia statutes in Colorado. And like, honestly, particularly with state level legislators, like emailing and just asking for an appointment, you know, pre-pandemic, obviously, but now I think everything's moving to Zoom. Like they take you up on it and like they're receptive to hearing from people. Politics really is 90% who shows up. You know, it's really about just like who physically shows up and, you know, pushes for the change that they want to see. And then there's that 10% that's money swinging around, right? Which is like a real dynamic. I don't want to minimize that dynamic. We actually had some legislation in Colorado that was completely torpedoed by big money around safe use facilities. And so like, that's real as well. But like, no, it really is astonishing. Like just making phone calls and, you know, making a nuisance of yourself, how much that really works.
Yeah. Thanks for the calls to action there. You know, everyone who's here can actually be a part of moving this forward and making your voice heard. I think we should start taking questions now. I think we're about there. Mareesa, if you're still in there, do you want to throw us some of the questions?
Yeah, definitely. And I just want to remind anybody who's been chatting in the chat bar who has questions to add them to the Ask a Question tab that's on the bottom in the middle of your window. And please take a look at the questions that are there and vote them up. So our top ranking question was actually addressed about cannabis being federally rescheduled. So right after that, we have, what are the corporate forces aligned against ending the war on drugs and how do their arguments go?
Maritza, you might be best equipped to answer this
one. Yeah, I'm trying to think about that. Man, I feel like that's a really tough question. Yeah, I mean, Big Pharma might be, you know, obviously somebody who's not on our side. I think they do have, you know, a financial incentive to make sure that, you know, they have control over all drugs that people are getting. You know, we talked about private prisons earlier. The private prison industry is huge, and they're like very diverse. So like they will survive if private prisons are, you know, prohibited in the US because they've diversified so much and they're like literally billion-dollar entities. So that's really scary. And not only that, but they're all over this country, like working as lobbyists, which is, you know, and influencing conservative legislation. Those are the two that come to mind, but I don't know. I'm on the advocate side, so I don't really engage on that side as much. But I don't know if Mitch had other thoughts on that.
Yeah, so there's a private probation industry in this country that is financially huge. It's not as big as private prisons, but it's a large thing. And that part often doesn't get talked about at all. Like the private, you know, post-release control is a huge industry. You know, you often have to pay per drug test you take, and this is not the fun DanceSafe kind of drug testing. This is the, like, you know, testing your urine kind of drug testing. And so like it's a major industry. I mean, they lobby, particularly at the state level. They don't do a lot of federal lobbying, but I think it's illegal in Colorado, but there are states, you know, like Florida's the big one where, you know, in Florida, like you can't go up against the private parole industry on anything. Like they throw too much money at too many politicians, particularly even at the county level, right? So they'll like own the local sheriffs, like they'll donate heavily towards sheriff elections. And yeah, it's a major industry that is going to fight tooth and nail. I mean, you know, people who are on parole for smoking weed are just like the easiest parolees ever to deal with. Like, you don't generally have to worry about them showing up and like stabbing their parole officers. You know, like they show up, they pay their fines, they piss in the cup. And so, yeah, they're a huge industry that we're going to have to take on. And often sort of, you know, if you look at their board of directors and the board of directors of the private prison companies, it's often clear these are just like shell, you know, corporate structures for the same ownership people that own private prison industries, but they're separate companies. And so they have to be taken on separately.
I'd like to mention two other groups as well that are, I think, worth keeping an eye on. One is the cash bail industry. During the campaign, Kamala Harris said that she wanted to revoke this practice of cash bail, where people who have money can go to a bail bondsman and bail themselves out if they're in custody, and people who don't have that cash sit in jail until their court case comes up. So she very directly wanted to start dismantling the cash bail industry. And in fact, there's a bill in front of the Illinois governor right now, a state piece of legislation in Illinois, to roll back cash bail in Illinois. And so it could start potentially on the state level in that regard. The other group that I think is worth keeping an eye on is the Prison Guards Union. Here in California, the Prison Guards Union was one of the largest donor to initiatives to oppose progressive drug law reform. That shouldn't come as any surprise to anybody. However, a few years ago, there was some pressure put on that union to stop donating funds to those efforts to oppose drug law reform. And here in California, at least, that state union for state prison guards has stopped donating those kinds of funds to that effort. Now, that could happen in other parts of the country too progressively. That could be something to keep your eye on as well.
You know, plot twist actually on the prison guard union. Marissa, maybe you have more info on this, but my understanding in Oregon was that actually the prison guard union came out in favor of passing the decriminalization measure 110. And my understanding was that was because of COVID, actually, that the prison guards started realizing that, oh, their health was now at risk because of the overpopulated prisons, and now there's a pandemic going around. And so, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but as I understood it, the prison guard union actually was in favor of passing measure 110 and decriminalizing drugs in Oregon.
I actually didn't hear about that, but it wouldn't surprise me if that were true. That's actually really interesting. Yeah, because I think the takeaway from that is that mass incarceration really does affect everyone. Mm-hmm. Like, drug policy really does affect anyone. When we're thinking about just like the amount of resources that are spent towards criminalization, and those are our tax dollars that should be used to make our lives better. We're all impacted by this. And I'm thinking about this specifically in the COVID context, because we've also been fighting to depopulate jails and prisons in light of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And what the data has shown is that, all of these rural communities where these jails and prisons are popping up are exploding with COVID. These facilities are exploding with COVID, not just the staff who work there, but the individuals who are incarcerated there. What that means is that there's less hospital rooms available for the people who live in those communities. So it's actually creating a crisis for the people who live there. So that's just like, I guess just trying to make the point that this is all really interconnected and really does affect us all. When we think about who's a directly impacted person, yes, we're talking about people who have been directly criminalized, but we all feel the effects of criminalization.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, even before COVID, there was some pushback by prison guard unions against funding efforts to undermine drug reform just due to overcrowding. Prison guards realized that they were in more danger due to prison overcrowding, due to mass incarceration, caused by drug laws. So they saw that it was an issue, for their own safety, and I think that's one of the reasons that at least the union in California stepped back, and now of course we have the COVID situation to further amplify that. I think your point is really good about if there's a COVID outbreak in a prison in a small town, and people are working in that prison, they will bring, COVID back to their community. So it's in everyone's interest to secure the health and safety of prisoners and everyone who is associated with that prison in the community.
Yeah, thanks. Mareesa, what's our next question?
All right, our next question is from, let's see, Ryan. Has Biden named a director to the DEA? Are there any good possible candidates?
Good question. He has not, to my knowledge, named a director. I feel like that's not going to be one of the first appointments that we see. The Drug Policy Alliance is in support of abolishing both the DEA and the ONDCP. I feel like those are still kind of out there asks when we're talking about federal level asks. Nonetheless, that's where we've been. I do think on the ONDCP side, though, we're in a position where we might have to do some harm reduction and come out with an endorsement, or at least talk more openly about the type of person we'd like to see in that role, in the next drug czar role, because that's going to happen regardless, because like I said, we're not really there yet where I think this government would just completely get rid of the office. So, what we're thinking through is how do we elevate the type of candidate that we'd like to see in that role? Actually, there's an op-ed that we just published in December talking about this, and I'll make sure I put that in the chat. But no, to my knowledge, there has not been somebody named for the DEA. There has not been anyone named for the ONDCP role as of yet, but something that we're definitely paying attention to. Because again, we're pushing for somebody who's going to take a public health approach to drug use.
And I will say that, he had there was an Office of National Drug Control advisory board on his transition team. And it leaned relatively heavy towards law enforcement. There were some people on there who represented sort of a public health approach to drug things. There was at least one person on there who has publicly called for a complete end to the drug war. But that was not the majority of the people who were on that board on his transition team. His transition team, ONDCP team, concerned me. It concerned me. And so I was not super hopeful looking at that. But also, if you look at some of his other transition teams and then the people he's ended up appointing, they've pretty much all been to the left of the transition team, as a body. They've all, it seems like the sort of leftist wing has been doing pretty well when it comes to nominations. So I'm cautiously, optimistically hopeful, I guess. I don't know quite how to phrase it. I'm cautiously hopeful.
I've seen a couple calls to nominate Dr. Carl Hart for ONDCP director.
I would lose it. I would lose it if they picked Dr. Hart. He's on the DanceSafe Advisory Council. I love the dude. He's an incredible human being. That would be my absolute #1 pick for ONDCP for sure. Plus, having an ONDCP director who's an open drug user would be such a game changer for this country.
That would be true.
We can hope. I'm not holding my breath, but that would be great. Cool. What's next for us, Mareesa?
Next, from John Phelps, anyone willing to make an estimate as to when MDMA and psilocybin will be FDA authorized for therapeutic use?
Yeah, my understanding from MAPS is that MDMA is going to be next year. Is the last estimate I heard.
Yeah, end of 2022, and that's only because of COVID. It would have been end of this year if it hadn't been for COVID.
It's my understanding as well.
I don't know the timetable on psilocybin.
I'm actually not sure if MAPS is going to be the one that gets psilocybin across the goal.
No, it'll probably be Compass.
It'll be Compass, I think. Yeah.
And USONA is also working on it. But Compass, I think, is a little bit ahead.
Compass is closer, I think. I think it's going to be Compass that gets it across the goal line, which is astonishing considering 3 years ago nobody but MAPS was working on any of this stuff. To see the massive influx of psychedelic drug development capitalism, which I have lots of mixed and complicated feelings about. But yeah, I think my guess psilocybin is 2024. And then probably open market, off-label psilocybin. They'll have one treatment 2024, 2025, and then probably another year or two for it to be, open label But within the decade, we're talking about psilocybin and MDMA clinics all over the country. MAPS is pushing hard on Europe now, and so I think we're going to have MDMA legal in Europe probably 2 years after the US. And so, yeah, 2 years being, cautiously optimistic, COVID willing. Yeah, it's close. It's close. It's really, really close. Oh, and I just saw in the chat ketamine too. Ketamine is a Schedule 3. You can get ketamine treatment, I think, in all 50 states. I think there's at least one ketamine clinic in every state at this point. Mm-hmm. There's so many in Colorado. Like I get Facebook advertising. Like there's so many ketamine clinics in Colorado.
Yeah, ketamine is already FDA approved. It's actually not approved for the treatment of depression, but it is used off-label for that purpose. So you can get ketamine-assisted psychotherapy today. And actually, another comment on the psilocybin. It's also important to note Measure 109 just passed in Oregon, along with the Measure 110 where Measure 110 decriminalized all drugs. Measure 109 established these psilocybin services. That's not actually going to roll out. I think they timed it to roll out around the time the FDA approval was going to roll out. So I don't know that that's going to be necessarily accessible sooner, but it might. And there's also all this decriminalization happening. So I don't know, it's my hope that as far as psilocybin goes, maybe FDA approval becomes a moot point if there's decriminalization or state level initiatives that pass.
Federal law still trumps state law. So psilocybin is still illegal federally in Oregon, which I think is important to remember. Back to the question about Compass. Compass is a UK-based company, so it could well be that they will make their synthetic psilocybin available in the UK and other places before the US even. So that's also a possibility as well.
Yeah, and there's a couple comments here about, as we're talking about Compass, about psychedelic startups and capitalism, and there's some requests for a seminar on this topic. And yes, you ask and you shall receive. This is already in the works. I'm actually in the process right now of putting together a psychedelic economics. It'll be more like a mini conference. There'll be so stay tuned. That will be announced sometime soon, but that is coming. But yeah, I think back on the topic here, though, I think we're ready for the next one, Mareesa.
So from Brian Stengel, sorry, we got windows popping up. Will Biden give the green light on safe consumption sites and overdose prevention programs? Any speculations?
Let's hope so. We really need it here in San Francisco, and I know there's a big push statewide throughout California. Guardedly optimistic on that.
Yeah, I'd like to say that we are as well. We have been pushing for that. That's been one of our administration asks at the Drug Policy Alliance. Whether he'll do it, I'm not sure. At the very minimum, we'd like the administration to back off from litigation, to stop litigating against localities that are trying to implement overdose prevention sites. And last year we started to do some really basic education with members of Congress. It's something we're going to continue into this year, just because there are methods of making sure that the government lays off these sites through discrete funding mechanisms within Congress. So we've been doing a little bit of that work, and we'll continue to do so. It's very important, especially right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I really have been trying to push, particularly in Colorado, that we start framing this as the choice between safe consumption sites and unsafe consumption sites, right? People who are fighting safe consumption sites, what they're literally advocating for is people using in, bathrooms, parks, and so that's the in terms of a public framing, I think that's a really, really useful framing that I have not seen a lot of. That we are not talking about the difference between no drug use and safe consumption sites, right? It's not like if the safe consumption sites are not there, people are suddenly not going to be using drugs. And so I've been trying to really push this idea that the anti-safe consumption site people are actually pushing unsafe consumption sites. Yeah, I might be making some posters, some vintage World War II style posters on this issue. I've been trying to get some InDesign skills to that point, because I really, really dislike how hard some of particularly in Colorado, we've had major pushback on the safe consumption sites at the local level. That's been really frustrating.
Mm-hmm. Here in San Francisco, there are 3 times the number of people dying of overdose than are dying of COVID. That's a pretty sobering statistic.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully, we will see some progress on that. What is our next question?
Next question, it's a little bit further down, coming from Ryan. What states have decriminalized all drugs? And whoops, did you just reorder? Okay, what states have decriminalization of all drugs bills coming out this year or 2022 that we should be aware of, like what passed in Oregon?
So I think some of the work that we're doing now, I unfortunately have to keep under wraps until there's a little bit more there that we want to be public with. But if anybody on this panel knows of anything that's public that, you know, states have announced that they're working on, now would be a good time to share it. If not, that's fine. But you can expect more drug decrim legislation in the future, in the very near future, is what I'd say.
Yeah, I don't know of any offhand. I know there are a lot of people talking. Well, I know some folks that are exploring it, but I don't know that I don't have anything concrete yet. But there are definitely a lot of groups around the country that are exploring all kinds of strategies on decriminalization.
Yeah, definitely.
So Colorado, I think, is going to be pushing for a statewide psilocybin. So right now we have the Denver psilocybin decrim, and Kevin, who ran that, has been pushing for statewide, and I know he's been talking about it publicly. I've seen a few things on my feed. And also Colorado defelonized last year, or maybe the year before now. I found it hard to anchor time with COVID. So I'm not sure if that was last year or the year before, but yeah, so in Colorado, possession of almost all drugs, but not all drugs, unfortunately. But the vast majority of drugs now, simple possession is a misdemeanor, not a felony. And I find that to be a really helpful sort of midway point between decrim and where we're currently sitting. It's a little more politically palatable. You know, Colorado is a very blue state, but has a lot of very deep red areas. And you have to sort of take that into account when you're trying to do statewide legislative stuff, is that there's a lot of people sitting in the state house and state senate who represent areas that are very red. And so even in Colorado, where we have control of the House, Senate, and governorship, you still have to sort of come to these things in a bipartisan way.
Yeah, there is actually a comment here from Trisha. Thanks for chiming this in, Trisha, that Maryland actually has a bill this year for decrim. So that's awesome. And that's where I'm from.
All right, and next, we answered this already in the conversation, but just for anyone who joined later on, what legislation is the civil asset forfeiture at the federal level?
Yes, so that
the legislation.
Yeah, what was the legislation that listed the civil asset forfeiture?
That was the Comprehensive
Crime Control Act.
Crime Control Act, 1984.
Of 1984.
If you go to the Lucid News article that Annie and I wrote, it's also all of the acts are linked there. So each time we mention one of these acts, you can go to the actual legislation itself that's on congress.gov. So that one, as well as the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts, you can find all that there.
Beautiful. And then next we have from Lauren Kilgore, are mandatory minimums going to be taken out of the penalty equation in drug laws?
We hope so. I think we have a really good shot at that in this Congress. I say that because, we were talking earlier about Joe Biden, having a conscience and thinking that he must redeem himself for some of his problematic, legislation in the past. So I think that plays into all of this. Plus, we do have Democrats in both the House and Senate, and criminal justice reform is a priority with them in a way that it's never been with Republicans. So I do think that we'll see some sentencing reform.
Okay, I feel like we have time for one more question here from Alyssa. What role has the medical and behavioral health professions and professional associations historically played in decriminalizing drugs, and what role would you like to see these professional associations play? What changes in attitudes do you see as necessary for these associations to have a bigger impact towards decriminalization?
So at the Drug Policy Alliance, we do try to partner with professional health professionals, often including doctors, medical students, people who could really validate the public health arguments that we often make. We've done this with our work around marijuana. We've especially done it with our work around COVID and decarcerating jails and prisons. So public health professionals really do have a huge role to play when it comes to influencing lawmakers. They have more credibility, and that credibility, of course, can swing either way, as we've talked about earlier, you know, in this conversation with what we saw with crack cocaine. But they certainly do play a role. And if people here are public health professionals, I would encourage you to, again, follow the Drug Policy Alliance, because we need more people speaking up on behalf of people who use drugs and other people with marginalized identities. It really does help our advocacy work.
Anyone else?
Maybe we have time for one more. Okay,
we do have time for one more. I just wanted to pop the DPA website into the chat for anyone else who wants to follow. All right, their wonderful work. Let's see. Biden said he would defer to the DEA for scheduling. How do we get the DEA to remove whole plant medicines from Schedule 1? This is from Wendy Gibson, Viviana.
Oh, man. You know, in my personal assessment, the entire existence of the definition of a Schedule 1 substance is completely insane. Like the definition is you have to be a substance that has no medical use and high potential for abuse. But if you look on the list of Schedule 1 substances, every single thing on there has a very well documented medical use. And just the fact that there is anything at all on the Schedule 1 is kind of mind-boggling to me, right? Like, you know, heroin is used in the UK in hospitals, right? There's very well documented medical use. Marijuana is a Schedule 1 drug, obviously medical use. So to me, it's maybe if we just use if the DEA used its own definition for what a Schedule 1 substance is, that's how you get pretty much everything off of Schedule 1. I don't know how you, that doesn't seem to be relevant. The actual, as stated criteria don't seem to be very relevant for the actual scheduling though.
Yeah, I will say that I think the idea of Schedule 1 is not only unconstitutional, but illogical. I don't think it's a valid role of police powers to tell scientists what they can or can't use. Like, I don't think that's a valid use of the government's police powers. The role of the medical professionals in our society should be left to medical professionals. The roles of scientific inquiry should be left to scientists. That is not something that the government should be getting involved in, particularly when the history of how these schedules were developed and how the drug criterias were sort of assigned are so enmeshed with not only covert but overt racism, that it's just a useless criteria, and should be completely done away with. And I don't think it's an appropriate way for the government to behave.
Yeah, and the other piece of this question having to do with whole plants, this is an interesting bias we have in our particular culture, that somehow medicine is something that is a molecule that comes in a pill, and we don't recognize often that plants themselves as whole plants can be medicines. And you know, that's maybe a cultural shift that we need to talk about too, is that, hey, actually the plants that all these medicines can come from are actually themselves medicines.
But also, I don't think natural and synthetic are very useful demarcations for determining risk, right? I mean, look, cyanide is a completely natural substance. It exists all over nature. You know, LSD is synthetic and has no known fatal dose. And so, like, I think that we should also be discussing real risks, real benefits, and not necessarily, you know, look, the whole thank you plant medicine, you know, movement, the decriminalized nature movements have done a lot of really, really good work. I don't want to minimize that. But at the same time, I think that it creates a demarcation between natural drugs and synthetic drugs that isn't useful, isn't helpful, and in some ways is actually really harmful to other substance users, right? If you just
Okay.
You know, this might be a perfect point to segue into the second part and actually just take this conversation to everybody who would like to participate in it in the Zoom room. and we'll just have to let Mitch know when he pops back on.
Yeah. Well, I think what he was going to say was about psychedelic exceptionalism and certain hierarchies of drugs. So I can almost complete his thought there because we've talked about this a lot. But I do think that was a good point about, we shouldn't be saying this drug's better because it's natural or because it's a psychedelic or whatever. But yeah, I think, Mareesa, that's a good call. We are probably about ready for that.
Right. So again, for anyone who missed it in the beginning, a little reminder that this event is a two-parter, and the second part of this event is going to be starting now on Zoom. I just pasted the link. We'd love to see all of your faces for those of you who have been attending and just commenting on the side. We can actually see each other after this, and we'll have some structure to it. Give yourself a 5-minute bio break if you need it, and again, the link is right there. Love to answer any other questions you guys have that you didn't bring up here or that didn't get answered today.
Do you want to come back on the screen to say goodbye to everybody, Mareesa, before the Zoom?
Sure. I can do that myself, can't I?
I think so.
Woo! Yay. All right. Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming and joining us. It was a beautiful discussion. Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mareesa, Annie, Maritza, Mitch, who's not here. Thanks everyone for.
Thank you everyone for this discussion, and thanks to the audience. That chat was really engaging and entertaining within itself. Thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure. We'll see you all in the Zoom room.
See you in the Zoom. Thanks all.
In the room. Bye.
Bye.